Introduction. Victoria's Secret, for many, it's more than just a brand. It's an icon of global fashion, embodying glamour, luxury, and flawless beauty. Every year, millions eagerly tune in to watch the runway shows where models, dressed in extravagant costumes adorned with enormous wings, walk the stage like real-life angels. Everyone dreams of witnessing this unattainable perfection. Bright lights, music, sparkling smiles. All of it creates the illusion of a magical world filled only with success, fame, and beauty. But what we see on stage is just the tip of the iceberg. Behind these glittering wings lies another world, one that few know about. A world where beauty isn't achieved effortlessly but through relentless hardship. It's a world governed by strict rules, endless restrictions, and constant pressure. In this world, not only careers are at stake, but also health and even lives. The performances we see are merely a facade hiding the real struggles. Victoria's Secret models become symbols of ideal beauty, but few stop to think about what they must endure to meet that image. There are rules that are nearly impossible to follow, demands that push human limits. And if you can't meet those standards, you're simply cast out of the system. Failure is not an option, because everyone knows. If you lose your chance once, you may never get another. Behind the scenes of these dazzling shows are stories that rarely come to light. They are the stories of young women who, in pursuit of their dreams, enter a world where beauty becomes a burden and every step on the runway is a fight for survival. There's no room for weakness here, no forgiveness for mistakes. Only a perfect image, often concealing a real nightmare. Today, we'll tell one of those stories. A story that reveals the dark side of the fashion world, which at first glance may seem like a fairy tale. It's a story about how one girl's dream slowly turned into a nightmare from which there was no escape. A story that shatters the illusion of what it truly costs to achieve this ideal beauty. The beginning of the story. In 2018, a life-changing event happened for the young model Elizabeth Maxwell. She was selected as one of the few girls to participate in the Victoria's Secret fashion show. She believed it was her moment, her once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A girl from a small town, who had worked, trained, and dreamed of this for many years, had finally reached the peak of her aspirations. Victoria's Secret was more than just a fashion brand for Elizabeth. It was a symbol of success, a gateway to worldwide fame. She grew up watching those who had already walked the runway under the spotlight and dreamed of one day being among them, among those angels who seemed unreachable. And now her day had come, but her joy and excitement were short-lived. What seemed like the perfect opportunity slowly turned into something entirely different. After Elizabeth signed the contract, she realized she had entered a world governed by rules far harsher and more disciplined than she had ever imagined. She was told that from now on, her life was no longer entirely her own. Every action, every morsel of food she consumed, and every minute of her training would be dictated by strict standards. What followed was a period that can only be described as an endless race. A race not for success but for conformity to an ideal so unattainable that Elizabeth quickly understood. Losing this opportunity would be all too easy. Her workout regimen was grueling. Every day, she spent 8 hours in the gym, performing exercises that pushed her body to its limits. Even when she felt pain, when it seemed like she could go no further, she had to keep going. The trainers were relentless. You have to be the best. Just a little more. Push harder. But the most difficult part wasn't even that. The most terrifying aspect was the strict dietary restrictions. Her daily meals consisted almost entirely of water, light salads, and occasionally a few nuts. Food was no longer a source of energy. It became a measure of how well she could control her body. With every bite, Elizabeth felt fear. Will this ruin everything? Will I become too heavy for the runway? At first, she tried to convince herself that it was all worth the sacrifice. After all, this was her dream. She had known since childhood that the fashion industry was tough, and she was prepared to make sacrifices for success. But she hadn't imagined how quickly those sacrifices would exceed anything she thought was bearable. The daily pressure mounted. The workouts became more intense, and the dietary restrictions grew even stricter. Sometimes, She wasn't even allowed to eat an apple if the show was too close. Those surrounding Elizabeth, trainers, agents, other models, were all part of this harsh world. They didn't offer sympathy or breaks. Everyone was caught up in this relentless race for perfection. And even when her strength was on the verge of collapse, when her body began to fail her, she kept pushing, terrified of losing her one chance. Day by day, she noticed how her body was starting to break down. Weakness, constant hunger, and exhaustion became her constant companions. But the fear that she might not make it, might fail the final test or not meet the runway requirements, kept her going. Every morning, she woke up with the feeling that she had to take one more step, even if it meant pushing herself to the brink. Deterioration of Elizabeth's condition. Each day, the pressure on Elizabeth only intensified. Her life became a constant battle with numbers. Weight became her worst enemy. Trainers and supervisors monitored her every move, scrutinizing every change in her body. They were ready to impose stricter diets or more intense workouts the moment she gained even a single gram. Every time she went for a weigh-in, it felt like her entire world paused for a few seconds. One wrong result could change everything, and that was terrifying. The control was absolute. Trainers emphasized that her body had to be perfect for the show, and even the slightest deviation from that standard was unacceptable. Elizabeth feared every extra bite of food, every sip of water that might alter her weight. She lived in constant fear. They told her that her body had to be not just slim, but almost unnaturally thin, and that required unprecedented sacrifices. Many of the girls, including Elizabeth, had long forgotten what it meant to eat a proper meal. Before every show, models were not allowed to rest or even take a break. On the contrary, they had to continue starving to maintain the perfect shape. They couldn't afford even the smallest misstep because it would mean losing their chance. Hunger became their constant companion. Severe exhaustion, physical and emotional pain, this became the norm. Elizabeth was constantly in survival mode. She knew her body was breaking down, but she kept pushing forward. Every day felt like a disaster. She woke up in the morning feeling completely empty, but forced herself to get up and head to the gym. She would spend hours doing exercises, feeling her strength gradually disappear. Her weight dropped rapidly, almost without her noticing, but with each passing day, she grew weaker. Often during her workouts, she would feel dizzy, her vision would blur, and sometimes she even lost consciousness. Her body simply couldn't take it anymore. But even when she literally collapsed from exhaustion, she was ordered to continue. She knew her contract didn't allow for weakness. As soon as she faltered, another girl, ready to endure the same trials, would take her place. The fear of losing her contract and her dream outweighed any instinctual desire to preserve her health. She believed she had to endure, that this was just another challenge on the path to success. She had no other choice. She had bet everything on this. She forced herself to keep going, even when her body was screaming for help. Each day became a test of endurance. Her friends, who still had the strength to stay away from this brutal world, tried to warn her, but Elizabeth was already too deeply immersed in this vortex. She saw other models following the same path and believed this was how it was supposed to be. It wasn't just a path to success. It was the only path she had been told she must follow to achieve perfection. She believed that these were only temporary difficulties that had to be overcome. But gradually, her body began to give out. Pain, weakness, and constant fatigue became part of her daily life. Sometimes she wondered if her dream was worth such sacrifices. But the answer was always the same: it's worth it. I must endure. Elizabeth was convinced that if she didn't make it, her entire life would fall apart. And though she was on the verge of her own physical and mental limits, the external and internal pressure continued to push her toward the edge of a cliff.
Tragedy.
In December 2018, following a dazzling show in Los Angeles, which was supposed to be the highlight of the year, everyone expected Elizabeth Maxwell to ascend to the top of the fashion industry. She was one of the few who had endured countless trials and stepped onto the runway. However, no one knew that this would be her final show. After the event, Elizabeth suddenly disappeared. Initially, this didn't raise much concern. Models frequently travel around the world, flying from one city to another, working on dozens of different projects at once. But after a few days, her friends and family began to notice that she wasn't responding. Her phone was silent, and messages went unanswered. Colleagues assumed she had simply decided to take a break after a tough year. But with each passing day, the worry grew. Almost a week later, concerned friends contacted the police. They shared that Elizabeth had recently looked extremely exhausted, even sick, and everyone feared something might have happened. Authorities immediately launched a search. They tracked her location and eventually reached the rented apartment she was temporarily staying in Los Angeles. There, they made a horrifying discovery. Elizabeth was lying on the floor of her apartment, motionless. Her body was severely emaciated, almost unrecognizable. The officers could hardly believe their eyes. The young woman who had only recently strutted down the runway now looked as though her body had completely given up. They immediately called for an ambulance, but it was too late. Elizabeth was dead. The official cause of death was heart failure caused by extreme physical exhaustion. The medical team on the scene reported that her body was so depleted and dehydrated that it could no longer handle the strain. It was an end no one expected, but given the circumstances of her life in the past months, it was almost inevitable. The news of Elizabeth Maxwell's death shocked the fashion world. Those who knew her couldn't believe that such a young and talented woman had passed away so suddenly. But for those closest to her, it wasn't entirely surprising. Her friends and family knew what she had been going through. They had seen her exhaustion and heard about the brutal demands of the industry. However, even they couldn't have imagined it would end this tragically. The media quickly picked up on the story. Articles about Elizabeth's death appeared on every major news outlet. Journalists wrote about her rise in the fashion industry, her incredible perseverance and dedication. At the same time, more disturbing facts started to surface about the harsh conditions Victoria's Secret models faced, the excessive pressure, and the unrealistic standards they were forced to meet. Elizabeth's death triggered a massive investigation. The police and journalists began digging deeper. It was revealed that her case was not isolated. Other models were also suffering from exhaustion, malnutrition, and constant pressure from trainers and managers. These women were afraid to seek help, knowing that their contracts could be terminated at any moment, and their careers would be ruined. The investigation exposed that many models lived in a state of constant stress and fear. Their lives were controlled down to the smallest details. They were often forced to skip meals, work out excessively, and take diuretics to quickly shed extra weight before shows. Contracts contained strict conditions, leaving the women no right to even hint at fatigue or illness. Elizabeth's death brought to light the cruel methods employed within the fashion industry. What once seemed glamorous and enchanting now appeared dark and dangerous for those striving to meet its ideals. This tragedy led many to question, is the dream really worth such sacrifices? How many more women would have to endure such ordeals before the industry finally realized that health and life are more important than any perfection? At the time, there were no answers, but Elizabeth's death marked the beginning of a major shift in how people viewed the fashion world and its darker side. Consequences. The death of Elizabeth Maxwell hit the fashion industry like a bomb, exposing the dark sides it had long tried to conceal. Her passing sparked outrage not only among her loved ones, but also among the general public, who suddenly glimpsed the hidden world behind glossy covers and beautiful photos. It seemed as though her death had opened the floodgates. Models who had remained silent for years about their struggles and suffering finally began to speak out. One of the first to break her silence was Alicia Gray, a former model who had worked for major brands, including Victoria's Secret. In an interview, she revealed how for years she was forced to adhere to incredibly harsh diets, restricting her food intake to the point of fainting from exhaustion. Alicia recalled how she had to train for 8 or more hours a day, and even then, it wasn't always considered enough. She was told that her body had to be perfect, without a single extra gram. She was one of those who consciously walked away from a modeling career out of fear for her health. After Alicia's revelations, other stories began to surface. Models with international fame and those just starting their careers openly spoke about starvation, abuse, and relentless pressure they faced daily. Some admitted that they had suffered from eating disorders for years, brought on by the constant demands placed on their bodies. Others recounted how they were threatened with contract termination if their weight deviated even slightly from the prescribed standards. Behind the glamorous life, a true tyranny reigned, kept in secret for so long. The public outcry was overwhelming. Social media exploded with discussions. People expressed both anger and sympathy, calling for change. The debate centered on how the fashion industry was affecting the health and mental well-being of young women who strive to meet unattainable beauty standards. Many asked, if even the most successful models, working for prestigious brands like Victoria's Secret, were enduring such suffering, what was happening to those just starting out? In response to the growing revelations, Victoria's Secret was forced to react. The company quickly announced that it would review its policies concerning models and their health. The leadership issued official statements asserting that the health and well-being of their models had always been a priority and that they would take steps to ensure such tragedies would not be repeated. They spoke of new regulations, including regular medical checkups, psychological consultations, and more flexible requirements for diet and exercise. However, many viewed these changes as merely cosmetic. Former models openly stated that, in reality, nothing was changing. Despite the public declarations, working conditions remained as brutal as ever. The pressure on models persisted, though it was now veiled under good intentions. Trainers still demanded perfect bodies, and contracts continued to contain clauses allowing companies to strictly control the model's weight and appearance. For many, Elizabeth's death became a symbol of how far the fashion industry was willing to go to maintain its ideal of beauty. Rather than focusing on health and harmony, models often became victims of their own ambitions and a system that exploited them. The investigation that followed Elizabeth's death revealed that the problem was far broader than just one company. The fashion industry as a whole proved unprepared to take responsibility for the harm it inflicted on its workers. At many shows and after multiple revelations, it became clear that Elizabeth's death was not a mere accident, but a symptom of a deep-rooted disease within a system that had placed beauty ideals above human lives. Even as more stories of the harsh rules governing fashion houses emerged, the companies themselves continued to operate under the same principles, merely changing their outward appearance. Even society began to shift. The wave of outrage sparked discussions about how the media and fashion industry influenced young people's perception of body image and beauty. Organizations that had previously partnered with major fashion brands began to reconsider their relationships with the industry. Initiatives arose aimed at promoting a healthy lifestyle and more realistic beauty standards. But the battle was far from over. Elizabeth's death became a catalyst for change, but real progress required more time and effort. Though her tragedy drew global attention, many understood that more stories, more voices, were needed for the industry to finally shift its priorities and start caring about those who helped create its ideals. Yet the question remained, was the fashion industry ready to sacrifice its standards for the sake of the lives and health of its workers? And were the models themselves ready to say no to such cruel demands? Conclusion. This story is just one of many that makes us reflect on how far the beauty industry can go in its pursuit of an ideal. Elizabeth Maxwell's life should have been a success story, the tale of a girl turning her dream into reality. But behind the dazzling shows, glamorous photo shoots, and fairy tale ad campaigns, there was a truth that few saw or wanted to see. Her story is not just the tragedy of one model. It's a part of a vast, hidden reality in an industry that shapes millions of people's perceptions of beauty. Behind every perfect photo on a magazine cover might be a story of exhaustion, survival struggles, and lost health. From the outside, it looks like a dream, but in reality, it's a system pushing people to the edge. Models become prisoners of illusions and expectations created by society and the industry itself. They are forced to make immense sacrifices to achieve the perfection that's demanded of them. But is that perfection worth the price the system asks? After Elizabeth's death, it seemed as though the world was changing. The stories revealed by other models, investigative journalism, and the public's reactions sparked temporary changes in the industry. Brands scrambled to adapt, talking about new rules they were implementing to protect models. However, anyone familiar with this world knows, cosmetic changes do not solve deep-rooted problems. For years, the beauty industry has set unreachable standards, driving thousands of people to chase an ideal that's unattainable for most. Models, like many others, have become hostages to these expectations, and their sacrifices often go unnoticed or are justified in the name of art, beauty, or success. It's safe to assume that Elizabeth was not the only one. There are likely others who have sacrificed their health or even their lives to stay on top. Elizabeth Maxwell's story raises an important question. How many more stories will remain untold? How many more models, and not just models but actors, singers, athletes, and ordinary people striving to meet ideals, will continue to suffer in the shadows of this industry? And how long will society continue to support these beauty standards without considering what lies behind them? The world we see on screens, on runways, and in social media doesn't always reflect reality. It offers an illusion, the perfect body, the perfect life, the perfect career. But reality is much more complicated and, at times, tragic. Behind these shiny images are people with fears, problems, and weaknesses. People who have had to sacrifice more than they could have ever imagined to meet the expectations of beauty and perfection. The hidden side of this industry remains largely invisible to most. To many viewers, the world of fashion is a magical place where anything is possible, where success and fame are achieved effortlessly. But the more stories like Elizabeth's come to light, the harder it becomes to ignore the truth. And the truth is that behind the dream may lie a destructive price. The final question that remains after such tragedies is a question of choice. Is it worth striving for a dream that comes at such a high cost? What price are you willing to pay for your dream? Most models at the start of their careers don't see this dark side. It seems to them that it's worth any effort. But as the system's demands grow tougher and the real losses become greater, many begin to wonder, is this the dream they really wanted to pursue? For those watching the industry from the outside, this story should serve as a reminder to question the ideals we are fed. The beauty industry may be glamorous, but behind the shine are real people, with real lives and real stories. And if we continue to support unattainable standards, we will become part of the system that sacrifices health and lives in the name of beauty. Elizabeth Maxwell cannot be brought back, but her story can change the course of events if we learn to draw conclusions from it. Society must become more aware and critical of what it consumes and supports. Perhaps only then will we see real change, the kind that allows people to pursue their dreams without their lives becoming the cost of these illusions.